Welcome to Color Country Politics, where we discuss all the important political issues facing Iron County, Utah. Our guests include elected officials and community leaders in or representing Iron County. Today we are recording episode 3, Officer Friendly. Co-hosting with me is Jennie Hendricks. We have our special guest, Cedar City Chief of Police, Darin Adams. Darin, thanks for coming today.
Thank you very much, and thanks for having me. This is exciting.
Yeah, we're definitely excited to have you. A lot of people don't get face time with appointed officials, but you do so much in the background that people might not necessarily see. What are some of the big challenges that you see going on with the Cedar City Police Department right now?
You know, I think the challenges that we face are pretty broad across the nation. The current climate of law enforcement is challenging, as you probably all know. Mm-hmm. Whether it be the kind of the national attack on law enforcement, use of force issues, race issues, disparity, things of that nature. That does occur in some places. I'm confident, to say here today that we really focus in on preventing that and deterring that here in Iron County. And I know I can speak for the sheriff and the other agencies as well. It's important for us to try to address those issues, to educate our officers, and to make sure that we are engaging always in best practices and what is working for us. And so we do get a lot of that, a little bit of that spillover from the national critics. Mm-hmm. But I think the unintended consequences, particularly these last 3 years, has been because there's been so much negativity pushed out there. Our own Cedar City and Iron County residents have made it a point to reach out and thank us and express gratitude for the work that we do. With that being said, because there's that criticism, because the retirement changed back in 2011, because wages are lower than perhaps they could be or should be, especially comparative to other places around the country, people just don't want to get into this profession anymore. So we see the numbers diminish. And without the numbers and the bodies and covering those shifts and responding to calls, it is challenging for us to provide the level of service that we want and that we believe our citizens deserve. That's probably our biggest challenge among some others.
Certainly. I do notice that the culture here is very different from some other departments. Any interaction I've had has always been very friendly, very more inquisitive rather than confrontational. Yeah. What would you attribute to that difference?
And I want to know why you've had so many interactions with the Cedar City PD.
Well, when you're walking around at 1 in the morning in some strange place, people tend to be like, what are you doing?
That's true. That we always say that, nothing good happens after midnight.
Right.
If we see you out, we'll probably just talk to you. I think honestly, it's our community outreach. That is so important. It was important to my predecessor. It's very important to me, and we're making great strides in trying to engage our community. We recently had a lunch with the cop event in the city park that garnered, 150 plus people. We fed a bunch, and it was just an opportunity for them to come in and not necessarily see our tools and our toys, which they love anyway, but to just have a conversation and talk and see us as real human beings and understand that we have families as well, and that we want to keep them as safe as we do our community partners and our fellow residents, and just make that connection. And so I think when officers understand that that's our philosophy and our passion and our push, and the citizens see that from us, that it builds relationships, and we see people as people. Mm-hmm. And quite frankly, we need our residents to help us. There's no way that we could do what we do without the help of our citizens. So we need to kind of employ them, so to speak, as extensions of the police department. So
that's great. You had brought up working with other community partners. What kind of relationship do you have with other agencies? What kind of support do you give each other, and what is that like?
That's a great question, Jenny. I think it's phenomenal from my perspective. I've always tried to make it a point, particularly the last 2 years as I've been in this position, to reach out to these other administrators. We meet once a month, every first Friday, as law enforcement administrators. That includes Highway Patrol, the Iron County Sheriff's Office, Parowan Police Department, Enoch Police Department, Bryan Head Public Safety, Southern Utah University Public Safety, Conservation, the Division of Natural Resources, our Fish and Game. Everybody comes to the table, and we have a very good showing every month. So we talk about issues, we talk about what's going on crime-wise, public safety challenges, and support each other that way. And then, of course, when anybody calls, we're right there. That's always been something that's been great, is if we need help, the sheriff, who's obviously the kind of the closest, is always right there to jump in, and vice versa. The relationship I think we have is probably as good as it's ever been.
It's such a benefit to the community, and I think that's really reflective of the work that everybody in your position, and similar positions has put into really focusing on what is best for our people, for our community.
Yes.
And I think you're there. I think having those kinds of conversations is very, very beneficial, and it's reflecting in the relationship that you have with the community and how the community views our police forces and sheriff's office and so forth. You had brought up an interesting topic as far as meeting with all of the other agencies, and this had come up in a different conversation. Can I ask you about school safety?
Sure.
Because someone had brought it up to me, and talking about school safety, and as far as we've in the news all the time, we hear of shootings and so forth in the schools. What is the process for that? And the reason I ask is any of those agencies that you mentioned could be called on to respond, and so what is the communication like?
Yeah,
if that were to happen?
That's a great question. I'm really grateful to the innovation of some of our partners. Rick Brown, who's the chief of Southern Utah University, is currently on a deployment for the military right now. But he has been pushing for the last several months kind of a crisis response unification. And so for the last 6+ months, we have met in these monthly meetings about an hour prior to our normal meeting to talk about what we do in an active shooter situation, an earthquake, a campus shooting. It doesn't have to be just active shooter. It is crisis response across the board. And that's important for a campus, especially one this large, because of the amount of events that they have and people that come on those. So he's taken an active approach. When he left, officer or interim Lieutenant Jed Townsend has really taken the ball and ran with it, and it's been exciting. And we just had a training exercise that culminated these months of planning last month, where we had an active shooter exercise at Canyon View High School to address those very points. What does it look like when all these people show up, not only in uniform, but what about those off duty? What about those that get the page and show up? Or those that are at KB and get a ring on their phone and they're in there plain clothes and they show up and they go into the school to address that immediate threat, which we're trained to do, but they have no identification on.
Right.
That's concerning. So we talk about banners, and I just purchased one for every one of my officers, and it's one that goes on the belt. When you go into a situation like this, you just pull it out, kind of like a seat belt. It goes over your head, and it's a sash that's fluorescent green that says police.
Wow.
And so we're hoping that every agency will do that. And I know other agencies have purchased those as well. So the key is going to be to wear that with you always. So when you leave and something happens, you'll have that with you. So I think we're starting down that path of making sure that we not only communicate, but we have a plan in place. And this first exercise was just the tip of the iceberg. What I would like to see is to have an exercise like this twice a year, one in the summer, one at Christmas break, and use the schools when the kids aren't there. So it just becomes part of our culture. So we know how to respond. And, not everybody's going to make each exercise. So if we do this twice a year for 5 or 6+ years or 10, it's just commonplace. We know what we're doing. And then we want to expand that to businesses as well.
Sure.
There's a run, hide, fight training out there that teaches people the first thing we want you to do in a crisis response or shooting is to run and get out, get as far away as you can. If you can't do that, find a place to hide and barricade yourself. And last resort, if those two options aren't available, then you need to arm yourself and fight.
That's it's interesting. The school drills are great because you get that feel of how the school's laid out too.
Right.
Knowing your environment is really critical. You don't want to be like, well, what's around this corner?
Absolutely.
If you know ahead of time, it's great. On that vein, part of the current school district bond that's being proposed is about strengthening school safety. Did the school district work with you in coming up with those recommendations in that plan?
They haven't specifically. I know that when they built North Elementary, they implemented some safeguards and some upgrades there to address safety. And I think it's kind of a national trend. They've got subject matter experts that kind of know what that looks like. And so we're excited to see what those will be, because I believe that they're needed.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I know one thing that's certainly going to be a concern is the projections on population growth in Iron County are just astronomical. They're talking doubling in 20 years. And you know, it's not all going to be in Cedar City, but Cedar City's going to see that kind of growth.
Sure.
You know, how is the police department planning for that kind of growth?
So one thing that we try and look at, I just finished our end of year report for 2017. I was a little bit behind the curve. I try to get that done in early spring. But it does show that what we're doing seems to be working. Most of our crime overall, part 1 and part 2 crimes are down from 16 to 17 and particularly over the last couple of years.
What's a part 1 and part 2 crime?
Great question. So your part 1 crimes are your more serious crimes: homicide, aggravated assault, arson, burglary, and some of those things. And then the part 2 crimes are theft and things of those nature, not such serious crimes. And then you have your quality of life crimes, disorderly conduct, intoxication, and things of those natures. So we look at calls for service as we do that. We look at time of day, day of week. We look and see how many officers we have on a given shift, and then we adjust those accordingly. So as we do that, to try to beef up when it's busier, to make sure that we can not only be proactive but reactive, that's kind of our baseline. And then as things start to get busier, then we go to the council and we say we think we're going to need 1 or 2 or 3 more, and we try to plan accordingly. I asked for 1 in this last budget year, and with some of the funding challenges, we didn't get that. But that's part of my goal is I need 1 for patrol. I need 1 to add to our drug task force. I've got 1 agent in there right now, and the drug problem, as you know, is pretty pervasive.
Yeah.
So I think we're a little bit behind, but we're not so far behind that we can't catch up. We just need to keep an eye on year to year what that looks like, and as we grow, because as you said, I can't wait, even 10 years, let alone 20, to add 5 or 6 or 10 officers.
Well, and honestly, seeing a reduction even with population growth is great, because normally you associate population growth with not just a growth in raw numbers, but a growth in crime rates as well. But it sounds like you're using a very data-driven approach to determine where to put those resources.
That's so important to me, and I haven't gotten to the pinnacle of where I want to be, but data-driven enforcement, targeted enforcement is critical. And some of my guys, they kind of naturally do that anyway. They know where the crime's occurring, so that's the areas they go, and they're very successful, very productive with the arrests that they make and addressing these crimes with people. But we need that data to show us. Yeah. So, for example, there's parts of town where we never get called to.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean that citizens shouldn't see a police officer or a police car drive through there from time to time. But honestly, that should be the minority. They should only see them once in a while, because random patrol really doesn't produce positive results. Right. It's being in the areas where the crimes are occurring. And so that's going to be an even bigger focus in the coming years, is to really drill down on that.
Yeah.
That's fascinating. So we had talked about your relationship with other agencies, and just as kind of a segue, you talked about, arrests and patrols and things like that. What happens once you arrest somebody? Where does that go? How is your relationship with the other portions of the law enforcement puzzle?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we have an arrest. That person gets booked into the jail. We have a great relationship with Lieutenant Cuthers, the jail commander out there, and then of course Sheriff Gower and Lieutenant Schlosser. We've all kind of come up together, so we have foundational friendships and relationships that really aid our ability to work together. There's always some hiccups that come and go. There's things in the jail as far as policy goes that sometimes don't make my officers very happy, and we understand that, but we try to get past it. Medical clearances is one thing that are necessary for people that are either suicidal or have expressed suicidal thoughts, or who are injured for whatever reason, whether that's through a use of force or an accident. And that can delay the officer's time. So the officers have to make that little stop to the hospital, get the medical clearance, and then on to jail. And that's been hard. That's been a hard adjustment. And sometimes they'll get out there and the jail will say, well, we think they need it. And the officer will say, no, he doesn't. Yes, he does. And there's a little bit of this, but that's minimal. And, we understand why that's important. Yeah. They assume the ultimate liability once that person's in their custody, and we need to make sure that they're mentally and physically sound. Yeah. So once that occurs, and let's take a more serious crime, for example, we do have a fair amount of sexual assaults and sexual abuse cases, particularly with children in our community, and that's nationwide, and it's unfortunate. It's very unfortunate. But it's important that we prosecute those and investigate those properly. And so an officer will book someone in on that. That'll be forwarded to our investigative division. An investigator will go out and take the let's say it's a child, for example, the abused child victim, to the Children's Justice Center here
Right.
locally, get that interview done with Division of Family Services, and then that detective will usually then make a call to the prosecutor with the Iron County Attorney's Office just to staff that. Again, it's another example of those important partnerships that we need to work together to make sure we're successful on the other end. If it's, say, an intoxication or some other case, then we'll arrest them, and then we wait until the subpoena comes for court.
Okay.
So we may not communicate with the prosecutor, and those are probably not necessary. But when you have a case that's serious, like an assault or an abuse, we need to make sure that we're following that correctly, that we've addressed the interview and any confession or disclosure that may come, and then make sure that prosecutor is informed from day one.
Right.
Again, it's that partnership that we have to have, and it's taken a while, I guess, for that mindset to shift for a lot of us, because oftentimes officers will think, this is my job, I'll do my job, that's their job, and that's their job.
Right.
But we've really done a great job, I think, of coming together and becoming partners. So we communicate from the very first day all the way to adjudication or resolution.
And I think that helps build public trust too. I see that a lot of the tension and conflict with people who are very critical of law enforcement and people who are highly supportive is a matter of perspective of, oh well, there's people, sometimes there's a bad call made, and what if we want to make sure that there's a process that there's a corrective process available there.
Sure.
And so what do you think are some great ways to build that public trust, to demonstrate that we are on your side, we are accountable?
Well, I think the first thing is to make sure that when we make a mistake, that we own up to it. And that happens. We're human, just like anybody else, and we make mistakes. And so I think the first thing is the public needs to know that if an officer makes a mistake, that we're going to look into it, we're going to investigate it, we're going to ensure accountability through our Office of Professional Standards, and make sure that we communicate that with them. I have a lieutenant in my office that's part of his duties that he does. And when something comes in like that, it's looked at. We communicate with the complainant that the investigation has commenced, and then when the resolution has come, then we communicate back, this is what we did. And so I think as they understand and know that, then that trust is built. And then in addition to that is just that communication, whether it's lunch with a cop or shop with a cop or some of these community outreach projects where, again, it's just a communication where we can sit down and have a conversation. And people oftentimes will inquire about, well, I had this experience that was negative, or I had this experience. And sometimes it's perception, but perception is based in reality. And so we can maybe steer them and say, yeah, you're right, that's a great point. I will look into that, or I will address that. That's unfortunate. Or this is what happened, and then perception changes because maybe it wasn't reality, and then they say, oh well, that's great. It's just oftentimes it's just that it's that open communication that sometimes is not as much as it should be, but as we do that with people, at least I've found that we make great progress.
Yeah, the Tribune a few months ago, they had a really great presentation on dealing with post-traumatic stress disorder and how sometimes the resources aren't there.
Yeah.
And I had the thought of, well, maybe this accounts for some of the bad behaviors that we sometimes see. What are some things you think that not just the city, but maybe even the county or state can do to help support those efforts?
That's great, a great question, and we've been very proactive in that regard. I just mentioned a moment ago that we had just finished our annual CIT Academy. That's a crisis intervention team training to help our officers understand and deal with our mentally ill population and people who are in crisis more effectively, and understanding, empathy, sensitivity. And my coordinator for that class is a combat veteran with a triple deuce. And so he mentioned to me, he coordinates the class now, and so as we talked yesterday, he said that he says, I have really made a lot of progress, not only with this class, but actually seeking help and being vulnerable enough to recognize and understand that that's what I need. He made a mention of an incident, a friend of his who had a small child who almost fell out of their high chair, and the friend kind of snapped. Instead of being concerned, they got mad. And he said that was my friend's response because of combat.
Right.
And that's how they reacted. So it's a relearning process. So one thing that we've done to answer your question is we have brought in a therapist. I did this at the end of last year and mandated that every one of my 45 staff members, officers and staff alike, sit in front of this trained therapist for 45 minutes. Now, if it took 10 minutes and they said, I'm good, then it was over. But it gave them the opportunity to talk, to be vulnerable, to get it out, at least to fill this person out.
Right.
And then if they wanted to take, subsequent visits, they could. I've created a peer support program. I've got 5 officers that are trained in peer support. So if a person has an issue, they can come to that officer. They're probably not going to come to me, even though I'm passionate about peer support, and I was the previous CIT coordinator. That is so important to me. But there's some separation there.
Yeah.
That's right. But as the peers are trained, they can go and say, I'm really struggling with this, or that dead child that we found, or this accident, it is really affecting me.
Yeah.
And I can't sleep. I can't do this. That peer support officer is not trained to counsel them, but to point them toward resources. And so we vetted a few therapists locally and in St. George that we really trust. And that's important to me, that we make sure we have trusted therapists. And I've seen a fair amount of my staff take that step to go see these folks professionally to try to deal with, especially some of the veterans that have, 15, 16 years of pent up trauma that comes out and manifests itself sometimes in unhealthy ways. So I think we're making great strides to address this, and the state is doing very similar things.
That's so cool to acknowledge that it is an issue. And once you've started to talk about it and recognize that it is something that affects our community, start taking those steps to address it. That's incredible.
It's exciting. Cool. It's an exciting time for us.
That is very cool. One of the things that I know we had wanted to bring up is the ballot proposition. Prop 2, the legalization of marijuana. And I'm interested in your thoughts. You had brought up earlier, the crisis that we're in with drug abuse in the area and how that affects what you do. What are your thoughts on Prop 2?
Well, I have to be careful, as you know.
Absolutely.
There's state law that restricts what we can say, and I'm not here today to try to influence anyone's vote or to tell them how to vote. In fact, even though I'm wearing this shirt, I'm off duty today. I drove my own vehicle here, so I'm not expending any city resources to do this. I just wanted to share a message, and I think it's important that people are informed, and they can choose to vote however they want, and I respect that right. But I think it's important that they are informed about what this can do. And from a law enforcement perspective, I'm just going to refer to a couple of notes here. So I'm gonna quote just a little bit of this position statement here. It says, unlike all other Schedule 1 and Schedule 2 drugs used for medical conditions, Proposition 2 exempts practitioners who prescribe cannabis from licensure sanctions, as well as all civil and criminal and legal responsibility. So without the threat of criminal legal consequences or even escalating fines, users have less deterrence for violating the Cannabis Act than they do for speeding. Furthermore, Proposition 2 establishes that law enforcement does not have probable cause to question someone, regardless of age, based solely on his or her possession of marijuana. It forbids state and local law enforcement from cooperating with the federal government on cases related to the Act. And so restrictions of this nature essentially tie our hands to the point that any attempt to enforce laws regarding marijuana obtained in any manner and used for any purpose would be pointless. And even more troubling, I think, for me and my colleagues, is that law enforcement will have less latitude in protecting our youth from illegal marijuana use than we do illegal tobacco and alcohol.
Wow.
So I think you could talk to any of my colleagues, and I'm a big proponent of medicinal marijuana when used in the right way. I think there have been legislators that have come forward in the past few years that have tried to draft legislation to address this, but to do it in the right way.
Yeah.
There are adults and children suffering alike that I think marijuana, particularly the CBD portion, has tremendous effects and can change lives in a huge way, and we all support that. We're just concerned that this proposition, because of some of the lack of regulation and sanction, would potentially usher in the use of recreational marijuana use, and at that point, then we're concerned. The thing that causes a lot of that euphoria in marijuana is the THC, the tetrahydrocannabinol. Medicinal marijuana doesn't need the THC in it to be effective. It's the CBD. And so if we see this come to fruition and some of our fears are realized when this passes, you may have people using this to seek that euphoria and then they get behind the wheel of a car and drive, or it's a dispensary that may be in a neighborhood, and how does that affect our quality of life? We don't know this because it hasn't happened yet, but we're fearful. And part of this comes from what is going on in our surrounding states. We've talked to our colleagues. We know the challenges that they're facing because of the propositions and the bills that have passed there. It's very concerning to us, again, from a law enforcement perspective and our ability to ensure the utmost public safety.
Yeah.
It sounds like it could create some tensions too if someone is smoking it at home and the neighbor says, "Oh, I can't stand that smell," and it's wafting over here. It sounds like there's not a lot you can do about it other than say, "Well, sorry."
Yeah, and we have that now. We get called quite often on that, and people say the odor is just overwhelming, and I can't sleep, and I have small children. If in this case, if that occurred, and we arrived, and the person says, "Well, I have a card, or I use it for medicinal purposes," essentially, our investigation stops at that point. There's not much we can do, and then the other concern is that this is supposed to go into effect. I believe it's in the spring of 2020, and so a person is exempt during the time it passes until the law goes into effect. During that grace period, we see as law enforcement administrators some concerns on what people may do to try to skirt the regulation.
Yeah.
That's I know is a big concern. I know Senator Vickers had a lot of concern about that loose language that kind of leaves things sort of up in the air, which quite honestly seems intentional.
Yeah. I mean, you read through that, and that would appear to be what it is. I don't know what the intent was of those that wrote the language. I just know, and again, my colleagues, there's 106 chiefs in Utah. Part of what I read here is from our position statement that was just released last week, that just talks about the challenges that we're going to face. And we had about just over 50% response from the chiefs. I think there were 53 or so that supported the statement, and one that didn't. And I understand that. There's several out there that are at the behest of their city council and their mayor, and they have to have that support. And so, they may or may not be willing to opine in that respect. But again, we're just concerned about what could happen.
Do you think with our large student population that it will have an outsized effect on Cedar City compared to other smaller cities?
It's possible. I mean, if you look at what comes in now and what people are bringing in, including, I'm sure, students, that could be a vehicle to bring more of that in. Not to mention what kind of dispensaries are going to crop up. Where will those be, and what impact will that have on a neighborhood?
And the provision in there to home grow if there's no dispensary.
Correct.
It's entirely possible that all of the cities here in the county may say, "No, thank you, we don't want to license one," and all of a sudden it's like, "Well, I'm X number of feet from a home, I'm just going to start growing it here."
Yeah, and then I think we've had that before for those that want to do it in an illicit way, and they start growing it in their home, and we've seen some negative effects from that as well. So if it's now legal to do, what's to stop that individual from having a kind of a revolving door from people all over?
Something I did see as a very interesting data point is in Colorado, they had been surveying opioid deaths since they passed full recreational use, and interestingly, on a per capita basis, the opioid deaths kept going up even after that, which kind of takes a little wind out of the sails of, we legalize marijuana and the opioid deaths go down, so it's a worthwhile trade-off. It seems to be kind of a not true at all, at least on that data set, which a reasonably good size data. I mean, Colorado is a state that's not too dissimilar from Utah. It's got this concentrated urban core with a lot of rural areas. I think it makes kind of a valid comparison between the two.
Sure. Well, and to your point, there's some concerns with co-occurring or multiple substance use disorder. We met with our agent over the DEA for Utah just this past week, and he said to have this pass, to have dispensaries in your communities, he says, will be the bane of your existence.
Yeah.
And he comes from, all over the country. He's been in other places, but he did make I thought, a very notable fact, and that was that in Colorado, people are being prescribed opioids for pain, which happens here and in California and everywhere else.
Yeah.
But now they add on the marijuana to try and address the pain. And so, and part of the hope was that they could use that and wean off the opioids because they're so incredibly dangerous if improperly used. And he says, what we see now is that they're becoming addicted to both opioids and marijuana. So he said about 98%, he said there's about 2% that have actually seen relief from the use of both and have been able to get off. But by and large, the greater majority have not. Wow. So now they're addicted to two.
Oh, dear. And
it's just, the body is remarkable.
Yeah.
But it will become dependent. That chemical release that occurs in the brain, it's hard. It's hard to stop that once that starts. And so, yeah, I hope that people will, over the next several weeks, educate themselves on this and really understand what this will do, and make sure that they're informed before they take action.
Well, we certainly appreciate your perspective. That's valuable, and people do need to understand some of the intended or unintended consequences of ballot initiatives that aren't vetted like legislation is vetted. When it goes through committee and the legislative process. So
it's a slow process, which can be very frustrating, but it tends to produce some pretty tight results.
It's intended to be a slow process so that you can get, the way in from vested parties. And so, well, we're sure appreciative of your time. Is there anything else that you want the community to know that we haven't addressed? Is there anything that you want to get out there?
I just would let them know that we appreciate them. We really do. We have such great community partners and residents that help us every day. They do a great job keeping themselves free of trouble, which we always appreciate. but we have a lot of people that call in and help. And if there's somebody we're looking for, that they keep their eyes open. I just feel, honestly, and I think I can speak for my staff, that we are well supported. And we feel that. We feel of the love of our residents and the support. And we just want to grow closer with our citizens and work together as we get our public safety increased and make sure that Cedar City continues to remain a beautiful place and a safe place to live.
Fantastic. Thank you. We really appreciate you being here with us.
Thank you.
Yes,
Thank you.
Absolutely. That's our show for today, everybody. Thank you so much for listening in. We really appreciate it. Plenty of places you can subscribe. Make sure you see all of our great future interviews. You've been listening to Color Country Politics, a production in cooperation with Utah Politico Hub and graciously sponsored by Century 21 Prestige Realty at 121 North Main Street, Cedar City. Special thanks to Amoeba Crew for use of their song Background Indie Rock, licensed under Creative Commons. Subscribe to our podcast on iTunes, Google Play, or wherever fine podcasts are found. Also, check out our YouTube channel where we post video of our interviews. And don't forget to follow us on Twitter, Facebook, Google+, and our website at www.colorcountrypolitics.com.